Hello, this is Freethought Forum, program by the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rational of East Tennessee. My name is Riv.
My name is Ben.
Long-time guest here on the show. Been a while.
Yeah.
And we want to know that if you don't believe in God, you're not alone. Right here in East Tennessee, you can find free-thinking atheist agnostics. This is a show for them and people committed to a life rooted in science and unfettered by supernatural beliefs. Never mind, okay, we're going through the show a little bit. I'm a very good impromptu person. The Atheist Society of Knoxville frequently has a fun meetup at a bar or eatery. Tonight's meetup is at Flat and Taps. Used to be Barley's, we've changed since then. It's on 7403 Kingston Pike, Knoxville, Tennessee. When you get there, look for the upstanding silver-jacketed copy of The God Delusion. You'll know you're there. If you plan to preach, proselytize, provoke, or punch, please don't. Rational of East Tennessee, several regular monthly meetings. The first and third Sunday, we usually have lectures, discussions. Here lately, we've been having more free-flowing discussions about topics of the day, but sometimes we'll have a topic, and we'll discuss it in length. And we'll later give you information about times and locations. All right.
I don't think we have to cover that part.
Yep.
All right.
Yep, pretty much. So, we're going to talk about...
We're here today to talk about myths.
Yes.
Modern myths and how they have come to be and how they are changing the way people engage with their traditional religions, particularly, I think, Christianity.
No.
So.
Seems the most relevant one in the area. Yeah.
Yes.
That's something I always think about sometimes, is that you'll have people who are Hindu or pagan, but they tend to be more innocuous sometimes.
Sometimes.
It depends, right?
It also, I think, depends on where you live, because
Right.
in countries where they are majority, maybe it's not so easy around.
Right, that's true.
But that's why we're talking about Christianity, because that's the main religion here in the United States. So, since we're talking about myths, I guess it's a good idea to talk about what a myth is and what a myth does. So myths are stories, and they are stories that have deep meaning to people. They are very often tied to tribes or nations, and they're often considered foundational and very core to the identity of a people or even individuals. And myths serve quite a few purposes. They give people a sense of identity, telling you who you are, what it is that you ought to be doing, where you came from, where you're going, and it tells you what your morals ought to be, or at least give you a reflection upon what to think on when it comes to your morals.
You know, I was just discussing this actually, just slightly on the cursory bit of it on campus. Well, there was a slight delay getting here. And was talking about how myths have served purposes in the past, and they've kind of been that, maybe sometimes influential voice in societies anthropologically, when everything was, there's not nearly as many checks against the might is right way of rule. So sometimes religions came in there and tried to help keep a bit of order. It's first attempts at governing, essentially.
Right.
So,
I mean, many of the world religions were not only attempts at managing or balancing or even governments and even doing government itself, but of course, a lot of religions were the way people simply learned to engage and understand the world. And so when we use the word myth, it's a word that can be applied to even the great religions. So when we talk about, say, the Christian myth, or the Islamic myth, or the Jewish myth, or even Hindu myths, it's not a word that necessarily means that they aren't true, and it certainly doesn't mean that they are true. But it simply speaks to what it is that they do for the people who take value in them.
Right. It's all culturally dependent.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes. So Uh, Today we want to talk about what we think is a new chapter in myth-making. And myth-making, of course, being how myths are formed.
Mm.
And Riv and I have had some very interesting discussions. We'd like to share some of that with you today. So, would you like to?
Oh, sure. Where are we
Start?
on the little?
Oh.
I'm kind of
No, you're fine.
surface going, but
right,
that is
we were going to start by discussing the rise of the modern myths and how they came
Right.
to be.
right. So far be it from my expertise. That's more yours as far as Christianity and
Fair
the literacy and so on.
All right, so
But-
shall I?
Yeah. yeah.
Oh, fair enough. So, one of the things that we like to talk about when it comes to the rise of modern myths is the Bible, because the Bible, when it came around, a lot of people today fail to really appreciate what it meant at the time for the Bible to be. For one thing, there was an incredibly low rate of literacy, which is the ability to read or write. And it was like roughly only 10% of people in the Roman world could even read or write, and not even both.
Which, just one interjection with something.
Yeah.
To even bear that in mind is so foreign to us.
Right, because we're so used to being able to do that, because we teach our children from birth
Yeah.
almost to start
Yeah, you have.
reading
I mean,
and writing.
when you talk about their ABCs and your 1, 2, 3s,
Mhm.
even making that statement
Oh, yeah.
is a statement
Right.
showing some amount of cultural,
Right.
socioeconomic privilege. To
Right.
even
It's
have
so
to make
ingrained
that.
in us today that we can't fathom that.
Right.
So it's kind of a big deal to understand that. So when the Bible was being formed, in the around the 4th century, the 300s, the books that were put in it had been around for quite some time before that, but only few people could actually read them or even reproduce them by writing. And that's something that people don't really seem to appreciate a lot when they think about it or talk about it, because it's just not something you think about today. And another important thing to consider when the Bible came to be was that there were very few books in existence. Because given that you had such a low rate of literacy, and given that you didn't have printing presses or computers or anything like that we have today that can easily and quickly not only replicate but disseminate all sorts of information, all sorts of stories, all sorts of discoveries, all of that, not available back then. And so you had people having to painstakingly handwrite it, all out over and again.
Right.
And as a result, you did not have a whole lot of reading material.
And the people who were in the position to be distributing and teaching and professing and basically guiding people and understanding it, it wasn't as though you could just go up to anyone and say, read this for me.
Yes.
It was more selective.
Well, yes, and it was often in a lot of cases, it was a class thing where, only the wealthy could afford to learn that. Or say their servants, in order to help them accomplish what they need to. So these are important things to consider, because they're important things that have obviously changed, and those changes are what we will be discussing, of how it's led to I think I would like to describe as a new age of myth-making. So, as Christianity began to rise, it began to become more powerful and stronger, and it started to compete more aggressively with the other myths of the world, whether it was Roman paganism, or any form of Wiccanism, or even Judaism, Islam.
But the Catholics had a device for that, right? They would basically amalgamate different religious symbols and persons
And even deities.
and deities into becoming saints.
Yes.
Very genius of them.
Right, and to put it in another way, basically it was like they were absorbing and breaking down different other myths and turning them into their own. I mean, there are a lot of things within even even Protestant Christian myths that are symbols, even like the design of the devil, say, that have come from other pagan belief systems, and they've taken that idea or that visualization and used it into their own. So it changed the Christian myth to absorb and break down these other myths.
Right, because you had at least, what, 2 or 3 or multiple instances of Satan and devil in the Bible,
Sure.
and they're all from different perspectives, and they're
Yeah,
all
that
they're all
too.
different entities in some cases.
In some cases.
Yeah.
But it is really interesting because that process, was simply with the goal of, clearing the path for Christianity in order to, indoctrinate and convert, the peoples who believed in those other myths. And, so, as we're saying, in some small irony, it wound up changing Christianity slightly to do that. So, yeah, and not only that, but you also had a lot of suppression with Christianity, especially with the Catholic Church, that they weren't big fans of spreading literacy around because they believed, and they didn't want the Bible spread around because they felt that the power to read the Bible should only reside with the priestly caste.
Those who are spiritually ordained, and also maybe I think it's past the time pain, but I think something special worthy of mention is the Council of Nicaea, right? You had Constantine decide, gather everyone together, and said, okay, none of y'all can agree on what this particular text says, but you need to agree, and you're not leaving until you agree.
Right.
And then so they came up with the divinity, the Trinity, and the Holy Ghost, Father, Son, and Spirit, and so on.
Yeah.
And well, I think its significance is as far as suppression, because even before that, you had more of a Gnostic sect who didn't quite make the final cut.
Oh yeah.
Right, didn't become the canon, but it was more of a personal relationship.
There's an excellent book by biblical scholar Bart Ehrman called Lost Christianities, where he goes over all sorts of early forms of Christianity that wound up disappearing after the Bible was officially put together because their books were excluded and deemed heretical and had to be destroyed by the church and by the empire. But yeah, I mean that is so even suppression started early. Once it became a set of books, and once it became an official Roman empirical religion. But yeah, so you had such a suppression of the ability to access the Bible or to even have other stories in a lot of cases, because other stories often came from, especially in those early centuries after when the Bible was around, and even before that, of course, a lot of the other stories were myths. They were things that people derived meaning and value and sense of morality from. And the church very clearly saw that as competition for what it felt its purpose was, which is to give people a sense of identity and morals and value and meaning and a sense of where they're going.
And I'd say also there was a human level on it as well, because while today we live in, not everywhere, but we live in, surely by comparison, affluent complacency. And not everywhere, of course. There are problems around the country, and that's a whole thing. But the fact that we're making this show now, right, means that we have the time to do that without, scrounging for, food and all shelter and everything like that. So there's a bit of societal impact that goes along with that.
Yes.
And the point being there is that when you think about, church congregation leaders and so on, there was a human incentive, much in the way it is now, but more of a spread out effect, of, think of your Joel Osteens, right?
Sure.
Amplified, right?
Yes.
So you have, there's in a sense, a very basic incentive to have people come, and you had the mention of tithing that developed, right?
Sure.
And that became something that became a very human, instinctive kind of, I need to keep this going. So there's a lot of elements, very many elements to incentivize versus what might have been other incentives to keep it going for the sake of the church itself. So there's to feed into the competition there, I guess. A side note.
Oh, that's a good point. So yeah. So, so the church, as we've been discussing, was of course, competing with these other myths and trying to push itself forward, and a lot of and of course the people who believed in the church and were part of the church and of the church were trying to, be good Christians and do that. Well, then we come to, the Protestant Reformation, where Martin Luther decided that the Catholic Church had gone off the rails and was wrong. And one of the big shifts two major shifts that happened as a result of the Reformation were that Protestants decided that everyone should be able to have access to reading the Bible. So in order to accomplish that, the two things that we mentioned early on about, things to consider about when the Bible came about, they changed those things. They changed those things by starting with mass media, where Gutenberg's printing press, the first thing printed on it was the Bible. And that was powerful because these Protestants who wanted everyone to be able to read Bibles, or at least be able to hear it and hear it from people who aren't just of the Catholic Church priesthood, they didn't have to just handwrite it out anymore. They now had something that could print it a lot faster. So you have that shift. The other shift being as well that a lot of the reason why we are so literate today, why we have, this assumption that, everyone can read and write or should be able to, is that the Protestants really started to push that because they felt that everyone should have the capacity and the ability to. So those were huge shifts, and the Catholic Church, of course, was not happy about those. But yeah.
Well, also, I think it should be noted, this really especially applies to basically the Western world. Because in the Eastern world, they had already established systems of reading and writing in language, and they were, I would say, even more sophisticated at the time.
Sure.
So it's an interesting little thing why, Revelation would be chosen. That's a tired joke, I guess, but yeah, I think the context there specifically more in the Western world, which spread out to became the Americas and so on and so on.
Yes.
But had its most influence going through Europe and beyond.
Yes, that is correct. So these two shifts had some very interesting effects. They had some very interesting changes that have slowly built since then up till now. We've seen, for one thing, a rise in publications. We've seen an increase in writing because the more people can write and the more people can read, there's more of a demand for things to read, and there's more capacity to write. And more people can write, and more people can read it. And eventually, of course, you then had very successful authors who could sell books for cheaper and cheaper because it was easier to produce them, easier to get them out, and thus you had a rise in accessibility to where people could more and more have access, like the Protestants wanted, to be able to read the Bible, and as a result as well, to read these other things. And then it's kind of already included in what I've mentioned, but as well, creative freedom. And this probably took a lot longer than the other two, because the Protestants were definitely fine with, people being able to read and write. Thus, the rise of other publications, and they even had things to write themselves about the Bible. So, increasing publications was fine, and accessibility was good because that's what they wanted for the Bible. However, the third thing may have been an inadvertent thing that they may not have been as thrilled about, which is creative freedom. Because creative freedom then meant people could interpret things their own way and put out their own spin on things and put out their own new ideas, or, by new, probably, a combination of other ideas. And, even today we see where even the Protestant Church, not just the Catholic Church, often gets very upset with some of our creative freedom we employ.
Yeah.
And thus, it was also so, with authors like Voltaire, who would write, very cynical and, things about the church and other governments and relationships. And a lot of people did not like that.
Although fortunately more benign than, say, critics of, just how I'm thinking about it, of Islam. You dare describe, Muhammad.
Well, in a way, because there was a time when the Catholic Church was much harsher than Islam, and a lot of a lot of Greek and philosophers and stuff, their writings only survived because Muslims preserved them. Because there was a time when they were, when there was a lot of open-minded thinking within the Islamic faith.
Well, that's true. There was
It
the
has
golden
changed.
age. It
Yes.
happened there. It was huge
Right.
scientific discovery, mathematical advancements. And it wasn't
And-
because a single Grand Ayatollah or
I
Ayatollah.
do not know.
One of them had the interpretation that numbers are of the devil or something like that. It was some kind of thing where they go against the nature of what we should be doing with our minds. That numbers place things, and
There are a lot of people who would agree with that.
and that basically was actually the beginning of the end, as I understand, for the golden age.
Perhaps that would make sense.
Uh,
But yes, I mean, certainly today we see in a lot of Muslim countries where there is a lot of pushback against certain ideas, especially things that are critical of Islam. So Christianity is by no means, the only one
Right.
who's been guilty of, this sort of thing, in history.
But I mean, you make a good point about Christianity. Really, you could say evolving as it went along, because you go back to Copernicus.
Yeah.
They were not too kind about his opinions of
Right.
the galaxy and the observable solar system.
Yes.
So
And that has certainly changed.
Yeah.
A lot, but yeah, and I think we'll get more on that later as to ways we see the church having shifted itself in certain ways, that largely positive ways even. But talking about shifts, well, before we get into the shifts, so we're catching up to modern times with our discussion. So when we talk about modern myth making and kind of a new age of it, all of these things we've talked about, the spread of literacy, the rise of creative freedom, accessibility, increased publications, have kind of, sped up over time, like, just a very sharp increase as we've gotten better technologies, TV, computers, even typewriters. All these things have made it more and more easy, more and more quick to be able to produce and read and interact with these things, and even the authors and all the stuff. And so we are now living in a time when we have more books than you'll ever read, more movies than you'll ever see, and more TV shows, more video games than probably you'll ever be able to play or watch.
yeah, I mean, there's just take for instance, you can go on. I know personally on my Netflix account, in my Quay or Q, Quay.
Q.
Q. It's always. I have had the spare time to just sit down and watch all the things, the series I want to watch, the anime series, the non-anime series, the movies. I could easily jump into a solid week, and that would just be just a scratch.
And that's, a lot of people binge on these things. So when we're talking about modern myths, like we described earlier in the show, when we talk about myths, we're talking about things that people are deriving value from, and that's the interesting thing, is that a lot of these stories, whether it's movies, television, video games, even comic books, even radio programming, and even music, a lot of people find a lot of their sense of identity, a lot about where they came from, where they're going, what they value, what has meaning, and even their sense of morality from all of these new things, all of these new stories we're telling. And it hasn't always been this way, and it's certainly a hard shift, a very new thing, I think. Like, it's been slow over time, but I think as we've gotten into the internet age and into the movie theater age, it's gotten a lot, this effect has gotten a lot faster. Because, you look at a lot of the older films, or, even older books, and, you can see elements of myth in there, and they are certainly mythical in some nature, and a lot of people have taken mythical meaning from them. But even more so, I think, today, as we're going to discuss, a lot of our more modern stories, whether it's TV, movie, book, or even video game, offer us a lot deeper and a lot more thought out ways of viewing ourselves and our world than we used to have.
Right, and storytelling in itself has improved. I mean, if you think about, we had some classics, right?
Yes.
We had the Iliad, and then we had we have many time later we have the what is it? The Adventures of Gilligan, not Gilligan.
Huck Finn?
No. Jack Black remake recently.
Oh, gosh, I don't-
Gulliver's Travels.
Gulliver's Travels.
Yeah, that much later.
I
In
remember that,
between, there
yes.
are all kinds of stories. There's stories that have been, along with increased literacy, we have more creativity. You
Yes.
have, case in point, you had, I think I mentioned this before, you had Tolkien, Lord of the Rings. He was a linguist, he was a historian. I mean, so many authors, I think, if they're honest about it, and I've read about in interviews, trace some influence back to Tolkien and
A lot of them do.
and more to the point as well, Robert Jordan, right, with Eye of the World series. I've heard its ups and downs. It's something I mean to read through. It's 14 or 15 books at this point. But on the front of Robert Jordan's Eye of the World, it even says there, and I paraphrase, in the quote, it says, Robert Jordan has begun to expand upon the world Tolkien created.
Right.
And it just goes back to show that we're building upon our past stories and making more.
And that's an important thing to realize is that myths often evolve and change, and not only that, but the new stories we tell are often Frankensteins of older ones or multiple ones that we've seen, and we're like, oh, I like this and I like that, and I want to bring these together because that would be a neat new way of looking at it. And a lot of stories are that, and it's really cool that happens.
Yeah, you look at Horace, and then going on to the stories of Jesus, and for example, just Christianity. You had going back there, you had the Moses stories built upon. You had one version, Adrahasis, and you get different versions of basically tenets following on edicts.
Well, like within the Bible itself, like for example, you mentioned Moses. If you want to see how an older myth can influence a newer myth, we can look within the Bible itself to see that in two particular circumstances. In the case of the Moses one, you have how the basic story of Moses' early life, where he, as a child, he was going to be slaughtered, but his mother stuck him in a basket and sent him on his way, and he went down the river, escaped a slaughter. And then eventually he led, God's people out of Egypt to the promised land of Israel. Well, in the book of Matthew, the author of Matthew kind of did a subversion of that story, where in this case it was, instead of an Egyptian pharaoh trying to kill all the Jewish children, it was the Jewish king killing a bunch of Jewish children trying to get at Jesus. And Joseph and Mary took Jesus and fled to Egypt, which is an interesting reversal, where instead of fleeing from Egypt to get to Israel, Jesus, unlike Moses, is going to Egypt to get away from a murderous king.
Right.
So that's the case within the Bible itself, where you can see an older myth being, part of it being taken and used in a new and interesting way for a newer myth, the myth of Jesus' early life. Another case of this would be I won't get too far into this one, but I believe it's 2 Samuel 24 and 1 Chronicles 21 tell pretty much the same story, but there are significant differences that it's quite some consternation and some interesting conversation. But I'll hold that off for now. But that is a good one to look into.
All right.
But as we've discussed, a lot of these have evolved, and as they've evolved and dug into interesting questions and interesting ways of looking at ourselves and our world, I think the word we've used in discussing this is it's expanded the way we see things, the way we see ourselves, each other, and the way we think from what our older myths gave us the capacity for, because they just simply did not have the scope that we have today. that
Right.
as we've evolved these myths and evolved our questions and evolved our our theories and ways of looking at things, they just it's taken time for that to happen, and effort and the capacity with literacy, really a lot of it's owed to literacy for that to even occur.
Right. As we learn more, we could not. It's not, I think, a one-to-one correlation of we learn more, therefore we have more information.
Right.
I think it's we learn more and we learn better questions to ask.
Yes.
And with those better questions to ask becomes more than proportionate, I think, the amount of information we get, and it goes exponentially from that point on.
Right.
I
I agree.
With some scenarios that some people would have to ask, the classical philosophical case of what do you do if, there might have been some versions of it, but we have a lot more detail, a lot more examples of, say, the ship of Theseus's ship,
not sure I
Theseus's.
know.
It's,
You'll have to just talk about
well, it basically goes, what happens if you take apart one ship piece by piece and build another ship?
Oh, I see that idea. Is it the
Some-
same ship?
Is it the same ship? At
Is
what
it-
point does it not become the ship, and is there something in between?
Right.
I mean, there have been cases
It's an
like
interesting
that,
philosophical question.
but we have a flourish of
Mhm.
other. Bertrand Russell, right? He was
Yeah.
very known for making all these little questions that dig in and say, well,
Yes.
it is, but it isn't, but if it isn't, but it is, So,
Yes.
as the case of a set of a set of a set, and so on and so on.
Sure.
And all that came along with more literacy, more conversation,
Right.
which goes back to, the very beginning, but.
Yeah. So, what we wanted to, I think, discuss a lot, we were very excited to do this, is to discuss how it is that these new myths, this modern myth making that we're doing, have changed the way we view things from, say, how Christianity had taught us. Because one of the interesting things that you and I have talked about in private and discussed is that a lot of what our current myths that we're making is teaching us really doesn't go with traditional Christianity anymore, or it's even beyond the scope of traditional Christianity to address some of these things.
Yeah, the more liberal churches, they don't. It's almost like you just pick. It's a lot of cherry picking. I mean, I know there's a very
Perhaps.
can be an insulting word sometimes, but
Right.
but it really is taking out all this worst, all the negative aspects of the Bible and just saying,
Right.
yeah, this is just
some
a
some people
guideline.
certainly do that. I think I've known other liberal Christians who rather than doing that and rather than going with the traditional view, they prefer to instead look at the Bible's books and determine, can I trust this book? Can I trust that book? How much of this can I really trust? And take a more measured approach, which I do respect. I respect that they, are taking the effort to do that. But when it comes to the traditional faiths, the traditional Christian faiths, however, I think that we are certainly witnessing a lot of shifting away from that, which is also why I think churches are having a hard time appealing to today's younger generations, because the church, as I was discussing, it used to compete on a mythic level. It used to really be good at it too, because there wasn't a lot of competition, and there wasn't a lot of creative freedom to create that competition, after they would snuff it out in place to place. So I think that we're seeing that it's having to compete again, and it can't just wipe out the competition like it used to. And I think that's an interesting problem that they're facing.
I was thinking maybe we want to, just for the sake of
Time?
the limited time we have,
Go ahead and start diving in.
I want to say maybe combined,
Oh yeah.
combine these aspects into.
Yeah, it's fine. So we wanted to discuss shifts in morals. So we could just discuss some of the shifts in morals that we've talked about, that we have seen. So if you'd like to start.
Oh yeah, if we had enough time, we could fill hours worth, but just try to be quick about it if we can. So something that comes to mind are, we have fictions. We have, well, obviously fictions, but we have anime. We have non-animated films. We have comic books. We have classical literature. We have all these things. One of them that comes to mind is one of the classic animes that I grew up with, Dragon Ball Z, right? uh, there are characters that have dichotomy shifts. They have character growth. One of them being Vegeta. There's this race of Saiyans, and he's the descendant, he's the prince. So he finds himself on Earth after all these things have happened, and he's this kind of classical villain archetype, hell-bent on just conquering, right? But eventually he experiences enough change and enough mercy is given upon him by other entities who are fighting, basically trying to keep him from what he wants, and eventually turns around, and at sufficiently into the series, nearing the end, there's this particular point. Spoiler alert: Dragon Ball Z. Here's this character who's talking to another character, and the only way he sees the episode is called, I think, Admonition, or it's called a something, absolute something, and he's asking this other wise sage character, Piccolo. He's asking him, if I do this act of self-destruction, do you think it'll be enough to make up for all the wrong I've done? And Piccolo tells him, he's kind of pained to tell him, but no, he's not one to mix words. So he tells him, I don't see all the wrong you've done, this one singular act to make up for it. I don't see it happening. And so Vegeta does it anyway, right? So put that in today's times. That's some existential threat happening downtown, and that's, say, Bob Mueller coming up to the scene, and he's done all kinds of wrong. He's been, you name the crime, he's done it, right? Against the law, whatever, against humanity, against life in general. But by doing this one thing, he'll rid himself of that crime. And he asks someone nearby, will it be enough to absolve me to get to insert your religion?
Right.
And the wise man tells him no, and he does it anyway.
Right.
He's, in that modern sense, he's knowing going to a religion for the sake of the people.
Even though there's no benefit to
Yeah,
himself.
exactly.
Right. Which is a huge shift. I think when we were talking about this sort of thing, because as you pointed out, there are innumerable examples of this, especially in anime. Anime, as we've discussed, often likes to deal with the concept of the self-sacrifice and of having a strong moral sense of defending those you care about, or even defending the innocent, or even, and sometimes even defending people who don't deserve it. And it's a huge shift from the way Christianity has often taught us to think about self-sacrifice, or even, how you should view the afterlife. This is a character you're describing who's portrayed as having, done so much wrong, and he knows that he's not going to go to, to the Dragon Ball Z version of heaven.
Yeah, HFIL, Home for Infant Losers, something like that.
So he's going to have to go to its hell, but he's willing to, give up his life and go there if it means, doing this good deed for people. And so giving up one's life, even though you're not going to get a good outcome for yourself, is very much not a Christian value. Because, the only person who did that was Jesus, and even then he did not stay there forever, and came back and, as according to Christian myth, comes back victorious and is living all fine now.
And even then, going back into Catholicism, wasn't it that basically it's a sin to take your own life as well?
Well, yeah. Well, so in a way, I mean, certainly, I think the Bible, however, does advocate for the idea of the self-sacrifice.
Okay.
Self-sacrifice being different from mere suicide.
Right. Okay. I'm mixing up my.
It's that's fine though. But there are a lot of them of shows and movies that give this sense of defense and self-sacrifice. And Dragon Ball Z is definitely a good one. I like to think I like what, even though it's perhaps not quite the same level of that, but I also think of even that silly movie, I think it's called Armageddon with Bruce Willis, and he, takes the place of, his essentially his son-in-law, and gives his own life instead,
Right.
when he didn't have to. It was a very nice thing of him.
Right. I remember watching that. It was very, very powerful.
And that sort of thing, of course, that sort of self-sacrifice speaks to people. I mean, that's why Christianity is so powerful as a myth. One of the reasons, I mean, there are many reasons, is that the idea that your God, sacrificed himself for you, that's a very powerful thing. To feel that much value, that, your God would value that much,
I think it's a very...
So it's a very
powerful.
common thing that people have a lot of emotion for and feeling for. And so when we're talking about the shift, it's definitely different, though, because in a lot of cases, the sacrificial characters in our myths give themselves up with no hope of something beyond that will reward them.
Yeah, to the pain of that you should do these things, and action Y, value Y, on and on and on, to please the Father, to be in ever fear and respectful of the Father.
Right.
Versus, we see people in modern myths doing things for the sake of other people, with no regard towards anything outside of that.
Right. It's just as an aside, often I've often heard it asked, or even sometimes mocked by certain Christians, not certainly not all. What does an atheist song sound like, or what does an atheist whatever movie or whatever looks like?
Yeah.
Well, that's the funny thing is something doesn't have to be atheistic. I'm sorry, something doesn't have to be bashing God to be atheistic. Let's put it that way. Something doesn't have to be attacking the idea of God to even be atheistic. All it has to do is lack God. So, there are a lot of shows, there are a lot of things that lack God, that are in their essence atheistic, because when those characters are dealing with their issues, they're not hitting their knees in prayer. They're not, referencing their Bible. They are dealing with things, and, one of the other things we have down here for one of the shifts I'd like to bring up for this is the value or nature of relationships. Two of my favorite shows, I think, do a really good job of this, and those are Adventure Time and Steven Universe.
Oh, yes.
They're amazing shows, and they're often dismissed as children's shows. And to be fair, they are shows children can watch. But a lot of what they deal with are often very mature relational things, or even ways, self-valuing things, and ways, mythic things that are just beyond even the scope of the Bible. They're like, I cannot think, having studied the Bible before, I can't think of anywhere in the Bible I could look to find a lot of the same messages and morals and senses of meaning that Steven Universe offers. And the thing is, there's no, the characters aren't bashing any God, they aren't bashing any religion, but none of the characters, when it comes to dealing with their issues, are praying to God or looking at any particular holy scripture. When they have to deal with problems, they have to deal with themselves and with the aid of others. And that's all. And this has been, you've talked about anime, I've talked about a couple of cartoons, tying those into the whole issue of, the church struggling with young people, and the church struggling to compete with these myths. I think that's part of the problem for churches, is that these shows do such a good job of teaching people how to deal with their own problems and how to deal with their own dysfunctions in their lives without having to resort to prayer or even to a higher power. That the role the church once held as that central mythic core in people's lives it's not necessarily being replaced. We don't have a whole generation of atheists or anything, but it's being minimized. And not even intentionally so in a lot of cases. It just happens to be what's happening.
And I think part of it can be, and the good part, the forward-thinking part of it is the aspect of, in some ways, good and bad, right? You're talking about kids shows and people take presumptions. Well, look at, for example, the show that came out in 2011. It was a remake of My Little Pony. And I like this show so much. It's so good. And you have John Delancey, who was at the unveiling of the Clarence Darrow statue
Okay.
when we had the Scopus Monkey trial.
Oh, okay.
He was down there, he made a speech.
Mm-hmm.
And not only, not you have John Delancey, Q from Star Trek, right? Brilliant.
Okay.
But not only is he a activist, humanist, secular, secular human activist, somewhere along, put all three together.
All right.
But he's given talks, and he made a speech about secularism and reasoning.
Okay.
But he's also the voice of Q, or not on Q. Sorry, he's the voice of Discord. My Little Pony.
One of the characters.
And he's the exact same character as Q. They both just mold reality to the whims. They're exact same thing, pretty much.
Okay.
And it can be dismissed offhand as, oh, that's just a kid show meant for young people. But no, this show goes deep, and it's a powerful. The songs, our understanding of musical science has improved. We know. We know what to play at the right time to
evoke emotions.
To evoke emotion, and you have those combined with more compelling and more compelling reasons.
Oh yes, and
it's very emotional, very powerful.
And it's not even just it's not even modern shows that know how to use musical cues. And I'm not saying this to disparage any church out there, because a lot of churches, I'm sure, just do this because it's just the way that they know it's been done. And so I'm not trying to suggest that at all that every church has malintent. But there are churches that know, people who organize, the structure of worship and, when the offering plate is passed and all this. There are certain musical cues that will encourage certain emotional responses and psychological responses in people. That's why they play certain songs with certain lyrics and certain sounds and certain chords when it's time to give, or when it's, when time to pray or anything like that, because those musical notes or even those verses have an effect, have an underlying effect that's very subtle and subconscious.
Yeah, turn your eyes upon Jesus and just as I am. Those two in particular, I noticed back in the days of church going, they played that when the plates came out, and it was very powerful.
Right, the music,
it guides you along.
There's even an excellent documentary called Marjo that came out in the 1970s of it was put out by this gentleman named Marjo, and he used to go around as a Pentecostal evangelist and make money off of people doing that, even though he didn't believe. And so he made a documentary exposing himself doing this because he felt awful about it after a while. And he talks about how, he'd talk about how even his hand and arm motions and things he would say, he was coached by his mother that, okay, when it's time to give, do this or say this, because that will get them to give more. So, again, I do not mean at all to disparage, all church members or all church leaders, because certainly is not the case. But this is certainly the case in some cases.
Right, it's the gray line. It's
sure. But I guess we're getting a little off topic.
Yeah, sorry.
So then, I think we have a question.
Oh. We have a question.
Oh, if you want to just bring it here.
Yeah, sorry.
We do have a caller and a question.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right. How the people in Texas, L.A. reacted
to all the preachers that tried to pray for the hurricane to go away. So how should they react? Is that?
Do we have a comment on how the people in Texas and Louisiana?
On how they should react?
Or do we know how they reacted?
Oh, I don't know if we know.
Or if not, how?
Sure.
How do we react?
I don't know how. To prayers. I think when it comes to prayer, I personally do not believe that prayer is effective, because of course I am an atheist, therefore I don't believe there is a God. But when it comes to when people offer to pray, or when people do pray, my response to that is, I think that's very well intentioned of them, because these are people who, odds are, do not have other means to help. And they feel powerless and feel a desire to help, a deep desire to help, but they can't. And so the best thing they know to do is to appeal to the higher power they personally believe in. And so while I may not believe in that, I certainly would not begrudge them.
Right, and that's a good point to make. I think it was, I want to say it might have been Penn Jillette, or might have been Daniel Dennett. It might have been Matt Dillahunty.
What was that?
Some influential, people
Sure.
all in the field were basically given a more generous interpretation of when you, oh, I'll pray for you, right? It can be easy to be cynical about it
Sure.
and say, show me this prayer and what it does,
Yes.
right? Because prayer, it's the God will answer yes, no, or maybe.
Right.
And you can do the exact same thing for a floating saucer pan in the middle of Venus.
For us atheists, prayer for us just does not make sense.
Right, but interpretively, generously interpreted,
Certainly.
it's they're appealing to what they believe, at least maybe in the middle of not sure, but at least it's somewhere, they're appealing to the higher power, as you said,
Yes.
to try to intercede and enact
On
an
someone's
intercessory prayer
Right.
to go against the will of whatever creator, to say, yeah, I know your plan might have been this, but I
Right.
really want you to take care of my aunt and uncle or my friend or just the people in general.
Right.
And
it's
so on and so
it's
on.
certainly hard to comment on even the mentality of the people praying, because many people pray for different reasons and with different rationalizations, and there's no one rationalization. So there's a lot of different people. But,
Yeah, but I'd say it's certainly more, I would assume that it's I guess I'm going to repeat the same thing you're saying, that it's
okay.
well intended,
Certainly.
that it's not malicious, and
Right.
that sometimes that can be somewhat pseudo relieving. It's a kind of it gives them closure to a sense. Well, I've done what I could.
Sure.
I would say maybe it's more effective to write someone or to maybe try to speak out to legislators and so on, but the gesture is well intended, is what.
However, we are getting close to time, so we may want to wrap up our subject.
So we need like 3 hours to even talk about this.
We often take more time than this. So, there are many other ways that things have shifted. There are many other shows and movies. Some of the ones I thought of were like The Matrix and Rick and Morty. Both of those have done wonders for giving us deep concepts to consider when it comes to relationships, morals, philosophies. And a lot of the problems and again, the problems that a lot of this is producing for Christianity is literary criticism, moral criticism, having to share mythic space now with these new myths, and it's expanding the conversation, I think, a little past its grasp. So who knows what the future may hold, but it's time to close our show, I think.
I will say I'm optimistic, though. I'm optimistic, and I have, I think, well-placed reasonable hope that that society, the consciousness will rise, and more people are learning, more people are asking questions, and I think overall, mathematically, we're in better than not. It won't appear that way at first. I think I'll try to be optimistic about it, though.
Fair enough. Optimism is good.
Yeah. This will be kind of rushed. Let's kind of go through it a little fast. So it's time to wrap up. Pens and papers, information to write down. This has been a Freethought Forum program for the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee. Feedback, 865-272-9060, freethoughtforum@yahoo.com. Most Tuesdays, 5 to 6 on ctvknox.org. We'd like to thank Sam and Leah, and you're not alone.